Hello, Thais. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here with you.
It's so fun. I would love it if you could introduce yourself to the good people. I feel like I always do a better job introducing myself than anyone else. So, who
Well, my
are you,
name is
sweetie?
Thais.
Yeah.
My name is Thais. I am from Toronto, Ontario. I know we were just chatting a little bit about that. And I spent a lot of time running our programs at the Personal Development School. I have a background in psychology, especially transpersonal psychology, a PhD in pastoral counseling, and a big focus area around hypnotherapy. So I've spent the last quite a few years, the last 12, 13 years in combination of private practice, then retired my private practice and went into building programs at the Personal Development School and focus a lot on attachment styles and attachment theory in that space too.
And I love talking about attachment. It's such a important topic that I'm really glad is finally getting its due. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. One of the things as you know, my work is really about the evidence base, right? The place where the science and the woo meet, and really making sure that people understand a lot of the things we're seeing as like hashtag trends in hashtag education these days. You know what I mean? And really clarifying the pop psychology. So I want to dive right in since you're such an expert on attachment. First of all, for folks who haven't heard about attachment styles, could you give us a really, really quick 101? And then I have
Quick
a
101
yeah.
is your attachment style is basically the subconscious set of rules you have about love. So we get conditioned growing up. We learn what our needs should look like, what connection should look like, what to expect in relationships, what boundaries should look like. And you can think of your attachment style as that subconscious set of conditioned patterns that you've learned that we tend to bring into our relationships. There's four major attachment styles in a very brief format. There's the anxious attachment style, who tends to basically be quite needy and often clingy because they have deep abandonment wounds from childhood and a fear of being alone. And we have basically at the other end of the attachment continuum, the dismissive avoidant attachment style. They tend to be really marked by childhood emotional neglect, which causes them to fear being engulfed or enmeshed, but also causes them to sort of grow up thinking like something's wrong with me because we're wired for attunement in childhood. And so when we can't get those needs met, often that's internalized as shame. And then our third insecure attachment style is the fearful avoidant attachment style, who really shares in both sides of the attachment continuum. You'll often hear fearful avoidant also referred to as disorganized. They have both that anxious side, that fear of abandonment, but also that fear of being trapped, like the dismissive avoidant. And they tend to fear really letting their guard down and trusting in relationships because their childhood tends to have a lot more chaos. And last but not least, we have the secure attachment style. And the secure attachment style has a lot of what we call approach-oriented behaviors in psychology. So they tend to have a lot of attunement from their caregivers. When they cry or express their needs at a young age, the caregivers tend to go towards them, approach them, try to figure out what's going on and how they can soothe them. And it conditions this child to grow up thinking that relationships are safe. We can trust other people, we can rely on them, we can connect. And they statistically, as adults, have the easiest time in relationships and have the most long-lasting relationships and report being the happiest in the relationships overall.
And I feel like are the ones they're like unicorns, right? Like they're thoroughly securely attached are the unicorns of the relationship spectrum.
I think to your point too, it's like securely attached styles are becoming less and less right now. A lot of what we're doing is like focusing on how you can earn secure, how you can actually get into a space where you do that healing work to become securely attached because it's not like a diagnosis or a disorder.
Right.
But I think especially now with the world sort of the way it is and a lot of the things that we're seeing, it's harder and harder to have a securely attached child being raised with all the stressors and pressure that's happening in the world.
Yeah. But I also feel like there's so much more education. I mean, I'm not a parent, so who am I to say? But I would only imagine that. I don't know. I hear my clients like, they're watching so many reels and reading so many books and learning so much about gentle parenting, but assertive, but affirmative. I feel like,
Absolutely.
I guess I have hope when I look at my friends and my clients.
I agree with you 100%. But I think that that speaks to the point that we can do that earned secure work, right? That's where we
Mm,
can do that healing because there's more emotional literacy that's becoming
yeah.
mainstream, because there's more introspection. And I love that whole realm of conscious parenting and really teaching
Yeah.
children, like, in healthier forms instead of that traditional punishment reward system or classical conditioning system, which is essentially a lot of small t trauma that happens repeatedly over time to individuals at a young age.
It really adds up, right? And it's no wonder we don't feel, I talk about when I define codependent thinking, it happens as a result of a lack of felt embodied safety,
Mhm.
belonging, and worth.
Yeah,
And like, yeah, that classical conditioning takes all three of those things right off the table so quickly, right?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's a human to do? Right? If you've learned enough to know I don't have that secure unicorn style. What do we do?
Okay, so there has been a lot of research that we've done on this topic as a whole. So there was obviously original traditional attachment theory with John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, and it was great work, amazing stuff. But they never really shifted into how we can change our attachment style. And we're not born with an attachment style. And as someone like myself, who has a big background in hypnotherapy and like the subconscious mind and how we receive our conditioned patterns, it was like, well, we get conditioned with an attachment style, and so we can leverage those principles of neuroplasticity and subconscious reprogramming to recondition. So we've narrowed it down, and this is through, I was in private practice seeing about 40 to 45 clients a week for the better part of
Oof.
10 years.
Yeah.
And I, had something like 15,000 to 18,000 client sessions and focused a lot in the specific area. And with a lot of that sort of firsthand research, I found that there are basically five major areas that we can focus on to become securely attached. Number one is reconditioning these fears we have about love based on our childhood. So these ideas that I will always be betrayed, or I will be abandoned, or I will be trapped, or I'll always end up with the wrong person. We have to recondition those stories that we have because of painful events in our past that our subconscious mind has stored. Number two, after we do that core wound reconditioning, we have to learn what our needs are and how to meet them in relationship to self. If we do that, we actually have the capacity to self-soothe rather than just self-numb that you would see with a dismissive avoidant, or try to get everybody else to soothe us if we're more
Right.
anxiously. The third thing is we need emotional regulation work. So that has a lot to do with our nervous system work, meditation, breath work, body scans, all these things that we can do to become more embodied. And once we've done those three things in relationship to self first, so we've learned to question these old stories, meet our needs, do this embodiment and nervous system work, we can then actually move that out into our world with others. And that requires us to learn healthy communication skills about our needs and healthy boundaries. And if we focus on those five crucial areas, and we've got really big tools for how to tap into each of those five areas and how to actually recondition at a subconscious level, that's where we'll end up seeing that we become securely attached.
Mm. It's really important. I love that we're starting off with the hope piece,
Yeah.
right? Because it's just so easy to go into that pit of despair where it's like, all right, well, XYZ happened in my childhood. I guess I'm like perma effed. You know what I mean?
100%. And I want to say something to that that's so important. I say this all the time to people in our programs, but I would, especially when I was in client practice, I never cared when couples would come in to work with me. I never cared how much trauma somebody had. Like it was
Mhm.
irrelevant to me. Like I don't care how much trauma, what type of trauma. That was not going to impact if somebody becomes securely attached. It was, are both people willing to do the work? And as
Mm.
long as we're willing to do that work, I think that something that's so important to recognize is that there's two things about the subconscious mind. Number one, your subconscious and unconscious mind collectively are responsible for 95 to 97% of your beliefs, thoughts, emotions, actions.
It's so
Our
bonkers. It's just so, just to interrupt, it's just so wild to be a human walking around the world thinking we have so much control over what we're thinking, right? And then we pause and we think we're getting so meta, and then meta about being meta. But, but,
a lot, there's usually a lot more going on beneath the surface. All of our autopilot
well,
programs and conditioned
yeah, that
patterns.
limbic system. Yeah,
Yeah.
we talk a lot about the lizard brain around here. And yeah, it just runs the show. All right, go on, go on. You were on number two, I believe.
Yeah, no, I love it. And so we have that conscious mind is roughly 3 to 5%. And then the second big piece is that your conscious mind cannot outwill or overpower your subconscious mind. And that's, you see this in human behavior, right? You see like people who go, I want to make sure that I set my New Year's resolution, I'm going to quit eating chocolate.
Sure.
And it's like, that's
Whoa, whoa,
great.
whoa. We cannot, people, please do not ever quit eating chocolate. I just need to say this. The Mayans were right. It is the food of the gods. Thais, we have to be very clear here. Go on.
And so you'll see all these ways that we do this. We're like, I'm going to stop getting angry in relationships.
Sure.
I'm going
I'll
to
take
start
that
setting
one.
healthy boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to do all these things. And we have all of these things that we say that we're going to do, but when we don't follow through, what that's actually illustrating is the difference between our conscious mind's intentions and our subconscious programming and conditioning. So when we can tap in and we can tackle those 5 areas, reprogramming those fearful ideas about relationships, meeting our needs, doing some nervous system work, communication, boundary work, when we can tackle those 5 areas in a way that allows us to actually recondition our subconscious programs, that is where we'll really see the needle move. And that's where we'll see there's not just hope, but it's very, very feasible to become securely attached.
It's so beautiful. So I'm really excited to have an attachment nerd expert here for this one. So I've come to understand that our attachment styles are our survival styles, right? It's the way we learned in childhood to get through childhood. And it's the way we relate towards people on whom we are literally dependent, right? Like kids on caregivers. And so it doesn't make sense to me then. Like, let's complicate this when people say, oh, I'm so insecure in romantic relationships. How do you think about that? Because to me, it doesn't quite click, you know?
Okay. Yeah. So it's a great question. And I love the nuances of this. So there's a couple things that I'll sort of go into at the backstory of it. So the first thing is that our subconscious mind and our attachment style forms because of repetition and emotion. It's how we fire and wire those neural pathways and form those patterns. It's also really important to recognize that our subconscious mind is an association making machine. So generally, and a lot of the traditional attachment theory research out of Cambridge University with John Bowlby discussed how we actually replace our childhood relationships with our primary caregivers in our adult life with our romantic relationship. Right. So even though we may not have that same degree of dependency that we do at all in childhood, where literally like our caregivers have to feed us and meet our needs and clothe us, when we look at the form of interdependency, there is this component of us depending on each other in various degrees. But more than anything, it's actually that vulnerability aspect of it when we really let something in that triggers those subconscious associations that foster this degree of us feeling like we depend on this individual, and then we'll very likely bring out those same attachment patterns. So that's that sort of like, if you follow the thread all the way through, how people are feeling and experiencing it that way. The second part is that our subconscious mind can be reprogrammed all the time. So like our ideas about love, like somebody can be securely attached, and then all of a sudden at 8 years old, they go through this terrible divorce with their parents, maybe, or one parent perhaps passes away, and that could trigger them to form an anxious attachment style. Because we have neuroplasticity, we are being conditioned and reconditioned all the time. So there's sort of 2 pieces here happening. Number one, our subconscious mind is forming these associations. When we get vulnerable, it reminds us of the degree of vulnerability in childhood and triggers us to have those attachment patterns that we use and connect with in our adult relationships. It's just not necessarily as intense as the level of vulnerability we had in childhood with our caregivers. And number 2, we also have this dynamic of sometimes our attachment style can change or fluctuate throughout the course of our lives from relationship to relationship.
Makes perfect science. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So then, right. So then, of course, reenactment feels like it's quite a part of this, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I've defined reenactment. Would you please define it for the good folks and talk about how it plays out with attachment?
Yes. So the way I'm actually really interested to hear your definition of it, but here's an analogy for it. So the way that we end up in these reenacting situations, and this is like extraordinarily common. I think this is something that people have no idea how deep it actually reaches. But what happens is our subconscious mind forms a comfort zone. And it really doesn't want this comfort zone to change. So if we, for example, grow up as, let's say, an anxious attachment style, where we are taught that, okay, we have to stay externally focused, we have to please other people, we're trying to soothe through others. Actually, what's happening is that subconscious comfort zone in relationship to self is that we're busy dismissing or maybe avoiding our own feelings, needs, and boundaries in favor of externally people pleasing. And so guess what happens? Well, that subconscious comfort zone, we are most likely to be attracted to people who treat us the way we treat ourselves because it's what's most familiar, and what's familiar is safe and equal to survival. And at the end of the day, the subconscious mind is very survival oriented. So what you'll see take place is this reenactment. The way it's actually happening is that it's just our subconscious trying to maintain its comfort zone, meaning if we felt dismissed in childhood, we'll internalize that relationship to self. And we will go on to date external partners where, guess what? They're also dismissing or avoiding us. And that's actually that reenactment cycle playing out. And you see this with narcissistic relationships, unfortunately. People who end up in narcissistic relationships, I've never seen a person, and this is absolutely not me blaming this person, this comes from earlier trauma, but I never had a client when I was running my practice who had who was in a long-term narcissistic relationship with a narcissist who didn't first have these deep-rooted patterns themselves of being very self-critical, violating their boundaries, people-pleasing so much, manipulating themselves to be who they thought other people wanted them to be. So of course, their subconscious mind is thus drawn to people who will manipulate them, violate their boundaries, criticize them, etc., because that's what's comfortable and thus familiar.
Yes, I talk a lot about the comfort of the discomfort that your limbic system has said, hasn't killed me yet. We talk a lot about the things that haven't killed me yet being the things that your nervous system, your soma is naturally going to gravitate towards because, a new red berry in the forest you haven't eaten yet, probably not so smart, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So it makes sense, reenactment, the way the nervous system attunes that way and continuing to have the same attachment style over and over and over in all these different relationships.
And
Yeah.
really the attachment style is the relationship to yourself first. Like
Right.
that's where it's really coming from and sourced from. And
Yeah.
so much of our childhood is internalized. So I
Right.
often say to people, for example, your internal dialogue is often your internalized dialogue. How you were
Sure.
spoken to in childhood becomes
Right.
how you speak to yourself. And then we will often be attracted to people who mirror that back to us. And if we
Right.
take that a step further, your conscious mind picks up about 40 to 60 bits per second of data. Your
Mm.
subconscious and unconscious collectively pick up to 1 billion bits per second of data. So when people say like, how do I keep going back? Why do I always date the same type of emotionally unavailable person or the same type of person who violates my boundaries? Or why do I always end up with these types of situations or people? It's because when you meet somebody, you are taking in enormous amounts of information through micro expressions, body language, tone of voice, how long they may maintain eye contact, all these little nuanced pieces, and we'll end up investing in people. Only a very tiny, tiny portion of that 40 to 60 bits per second of data makes it to your conscious mind's awareness. And all of this web of information you're storing and taking in at a more subconscious level, that's causing you to be attracted to people where your conscious mind may even know better and go, there's some red flags here. But the subconscious mind might be like, well, it's familiar. And so we're going to
Right.
jump
I
back
love
in
a red
here.
flag. Yeah.
Exactly. And that
Uh-huh.
is one of the top three things that will actually determine what we're attracted to in relationships is if that person represents a point of familiarity in how we treat ourselves.
Wow. So then it makes sense that we would, by getting to know what the shiniest red flags are, the most alluring of red flags, that's the way to begin to break free of all this, right?
There's a one really good exercise that you can do around that. Absolutely. You can ask yourself, like, what are the things I actually call this your relationship shadow, if you're familiar with Carl Jung and shadow
Yeah, of
work.
course. Yeah.
And so I call this your relationship shadow. And what I get people to do is say, if you always find that you're in the same type of relationship with somebody, so maybe it's like you always have the same type of best friend and they also have the same patterns as all of your exes, and those are
Mm.
the things that trigger you. Or, these relationships that we find ourselves investing in, but they really trigger us. I ask individuals to sit down and say, well, what are the specific traits that trigger us? You look at individuals and they have like these patterns of who triggers them. So let's just use the example that somebody who doesn't listen to you is something that triggers you. And not you necessarily, but we'll say, person
Yeah.
X.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so let's say that person says, you know what, I always end up with partners who don't listen to me or friends who
Mm.
don't listen to me. That's my big trigger. Well, what I ask them to then do is look in 3 areas. Number one, and this is the first and foremost biggest one, where do I not listen to myself? Because
Oof.
what we're attracted to and investing in is that subconscious comfort zone. And
Yeah.
often it's somebody mirroring back to us how we treat ourselves. And that's part of why it's so
Mm,
triggering. We take
right.
things personally that are personal to us in our programming. And so that's that really big piece. And then we can look, where do I not listen back reactively? So where do I represent the same behavior or trait back to the person I'm judging? Which is often we'll see that reactive form of it. Somebody doesn't listen to me, and maybe I go, I'm not going to listen to you either.
Right. Right.
And
Which
and
is
then we
such a
can
comment. It feels like you're protecting yourself,
exact
right? Like, forget you
exactly.
then. If you're going to
Yeah.
be like that, like, I'm not even, forget it. Forget it. Right. All right. And number
Exactly.
three.
And number three is, where am I also doing the same thing to somebody else in my life and not realizing? And it's not always there, but sometimes when we look carefully, we see, oh yeah, my partner does this to me, but I actually do this to one of my parents or to my sibling or whoever it
Right.
might be. And so it gives us that 360-degree view, as shadow work is sort of contended to do. And people see this a lot, like, if manipulation is a big one. Where do I manipulate myself to maybe please other people? Or
Mm.
somebody's dismissing me. Where do I dismiss my own feelings and needs? And we'll generally see that part of that zone of familiarity is because we are treating ourselves that way, makes it comfortable, and then that's what we invest in.
It's interesting. In Anchored is my 6-month program. We were talking the other day about how we often resent people or get annoyed by people who allow themselves things we don't allow ourselves. It's sort of like the flip side of this in a way. So a client was saying that she's like, oh, her husband's so lazy and he just like doesn't take any initiative and he doesn't like, he's always sitting on the couch after work. And I was like, girl, when's the last time you sat on the couch? She's like, I don't. I was like, when's the last time you let someone else take initiative? I don't. And I get it. Like the house probably would collapse if she didn't do it, everything, right? So there's some reality in here. And the frustration comes from like, we have these scripts that say, I can't rest, I can't stop, I can't pause, that we project onto others.
So I love this topic so much. So I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Susan Johnson, but we talk about the 6 stages of relationships. So you have your dating stage, your honeymoon stage, your power struggle, statistically where most people break up. If you make it out of there, you go to the stability, commitment, and bliss stages. Bliss is like honeymoon stage, but without the mask. You know each other more deeply. And the most interesting part about exactly what you're saying is that every single time that we get triggered by somebody, usually in the power struggle stage, those things that really bother us, those were actually things that we infatuated with in the dating or honeymoon stage. So you'll generally see that people go like this in the dating or honeymoon stage, because we it's also our golden shadow. We'll attract our repressed. So there's three things that drive attraction. Let me backtrack. Number one thing that drives attraction in the dating and honeymoon stage, somebody who meets your deeply unmet needs from childhood. If you felt unseen your whole life, somebody makes you feel seen when you're dating them, it's like crack, right? Like people are like, oh my gosh. Number two, somebody who's expressing your repressed traits. It's where we get that opposites attract. Number three, what we'll invest in the longest term is somebody who mirrors back to us the subconscious comfort zone of how we treat ourselves. Okay, so those are the three factors driving attraction. But interestingly enough, you'll see the first two in the dating and honeymoon stage, and then that subconscious comfort zone is what really like takes heed long term. But we'll always see somebody in the dating stage might be like, oh my gosh, I'm so attracted to this person. They're so easygoing.
Right.
And then, and then the power struggle comes on and they're like, they never do anything. They're so
Right.
lazy. And
Mm-hmm.
so we'll tend to be, and it'll be like, oh, this person, they're so assertive. Oh my gosh, it's so attractive. And then the power struggle stage comes in and they're like, they never compromise with me. And and the way out of exactly that you were sharing, and I'm sure you've done probably this work too, but it's to learn to integrate those traits in a healthy way in
Yeah.
relationship to self. And as we do that, that's actually the purpose in a sense of the relationship. We integrate some of the traits from one another, and it actually brings a greater sense of wholeness to ourselves.
Yeah. Can you get even more practical, like nuts and bolts? What do we mean integrate that aspect?
Yes, great question. It means we learn to practice those traits in our own lives. And we do this a lot through something called exposure work, which is that we actually have to, make this intentional at first. As we talked about earlier, the subconscious mind, where we get that like actual wired sense of self, it
Right.
gets programmed through repetition and emotion. And a lot of the research shows that it takes about 21 days to recondition new neural pathways and get away from old ones as they atrophy over time. So what we'll see is that through that 21 days, if somebody says, oh my gosh, this person, they're so assertive, they never make compromises. Well, I actually, and this was actually personal to me, I was very attracted to my husband at the beginning because he was so assertive. And I thought that was such a great trait. And I thought it was so attractive. And he, and then the power struggle stage came along, and we've been together for like 10 years now. So this is years ago. But I was sitting there going, oh, like he doesn't make compromises. And so I knew this. I had this awareness ahead of time. And I was like, well, I have to practice being assertive and saying, look, I need
Right.
compromises. Look, here's my need.
Right.
And in doing that, it actually grew me into a healthier space. It also grew him into a healthier space because he had to be more mindful of those things and communicate better.
Right.
And it was beneficial for both of us in the relationship.
Yeah,
But when we
for
don't do
sure.
that work, things can fall apart instead or create resentment.
Oh, for sure. And that's where really focusing in my work, I come from somatic experiencing. So really focusing on felt, embodied, oriented safety so that we can be assertive. Right. Because if we're not feeling safe, how are we going to say my needs matter? Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that loops me then around to when you were sharing the five things to work on or to work through to step onto the other side of insecure forms of attachment. One of them was get to know ourselves and our needs. And this is something that comes up so much for my clients. What are your tips on getting to know yourself and your needs when you've always sort of pushed them aside for survival reasons?
It's such a great question. And so there's a few tips, and I'll say one thing too, like it's so important for these things to be drawn together because when we get into a place where we want to express our needs, we need that embodied safety, that nervous system work, right? Which is like
Right.
that point
Yeah.
number three.
Three.
We
Yeah.
also need though to recondition the scary ideas we have about expressing our
Right.
needs. If we believe at a core wound level, oh my gosh, if I express
Yeah.
my needs, I'll be too much and I'll be abandoned,
Right.
then we go back into that space. So that's where like that belief reprogramming is so valuable as well to make sure that we're working through those things. So when it comes to actually knowing our needs and learning them, one of the first exercises I give to people is I give them a worksheet, a very in-depth needs worksheet. And I just ask them, like, if you were in a relationship to somebody else and you had the perfect partner, what needs would they meet for you on a regular basis? And what I find is that it tends to really trend by attachment style. Anxious attachment styles, they want certainty, consistency, validation, reassurance, acknowledgement. Dismissive avoidance, they want freedom, independence, but they also want appreciation, acknowledgement, harmony, support, empathy, and acceptance. Those are big dismissive avoidant needs. And
Mm,
fearful avoidants tend to want depth, intimacy, closeness, novelty, exploration, freedom, and independence at the same time. So they have those sort of two sides to their
right.
attachment style. And I
Right.
find it helps to break it down that way.
And then on the day to day, right? This is something I end up coaching on and working with a lot. I don't know what I want for dinner. I don't know what movie I want to watch, right? That level of disconnection from need. I have a number of exercises I use with my clients, and I'm curious where you go to help people really connect in with that quotidian sort of level.
Yeah, what I find is that when people are most disconnected from needs to that degree, so not talking about like, hey, how can I fine tune or get more specific? Generally, it first represents that they're disconnected from their own feelings and their own body because our needs are quite clear. It's very clear. Oh, I want this. I'm decisive when my feelings are sponsoring that. And so, if we can first get in touch and actually do a lot of work to get back into our body, a lot of meditation or breath work, or I also have done I have a background as well in somatic experiencing, and a lot of that sort of nervous system work can get us more attuned to ourselves. And then I get people to really explore. So I give people a needs worksheet and I say, like, try to just vet and audit what comes up for you in your life on a regular basis, and especially around your triggers. So when something bothers you, ask yourself, what do I need to feel relief? Practice going back into your body, getting present, staying there for a little bit of time. And then when you've had that opportunity to reorient yourself, then go into your needs and be like, oh, yeah, I guess if I felt seen, I would feel better. Or I guess if I felt understood, I would feel better. And then I get people to say, well, what is a strategy I can use to now get that need met so that they actually action them out rather than just cognitively understand them?
Right. Ooh, I got little shivers, right? It's just such a clear, I'm such a nerd for a protocol, right? And it just gives folks so many places to really sort of click in and make actual lasting change, right? It's very exciting. What's your favorite part of this work?
Oh my gosh, my favorite part of this work as a person, because I did this work, I was a fearful
Yeah.
avoidant. So I was like very attachment, had lots of attachment things to work on. My favorite part of this work was working through all my old stories, all my core wounds, like always believing going into relationships as a young teenager, I'll always be betrayed or abandoned or
Mm,
trapped, or, always fearing like being too close or being too far, and just all
right.
of the emotional energy that took up. And then to work through and really work to recondition those scary stories and those ideas allowed me to really trust and be
Yeah.
in relationship in a healthy way and really connect and let my guard down and trust the future, trust a
Yeah.
person, trust myself. And so really, when we look at our beliefs and those core wounds that we have, those scary relationship ideas, abandonment, trapped, betrayal, they produce a lot of negative thought energy, right? We think a
Yeah.
lot of negative thoughts when we believe these core ideas, and we'll feed into those things. And then we feel negatively. And then neuroscience has proven every decision we make is based on our emotions. So we kind of have this runaway train that happens. But for me, by reconditioning a lot of those core wounds, my internal dialogue settled. I wouldn't jump to conclusions
Mm,
as much. And I just went into a much more peaceful space where I could sort of focus my energy and attention on creating life or designing things I wanted or contributing rather than always feeling like I was fighting off something because of these scary ideas that were always lingering in the background of my subconscious mind.
yeah. So I'm hearing in their presence and intentionality.
Yes. Yep.
How beautiful, and how beautiful to embody those and then take that to your clients.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious, nerd to nerd, how do you bring somatic experiencing into this work?
Well, a lot of the work here is getting people back in touch with their body. And so we do a lot of like, in our program specifically, we have a nervous system regulation and somatic processing course. And I'll get
Oh,
people to spend a lot of time. Um, I'll give a backstory. So there was this study done, and you probably heard about this too, where they took participants and they put them into fMRI scanners. And they had the participants recall these really traumatic events or experiences, and then what they found is that a lot of that brain activity would go into the reptilian brain, the amygdala, get very activated. But then what researchers found is when participants sat there and were able to just witness the sensations in their body and label the sensations and describe the emotions and
mhm.
just get present with that, a lot of brain activity actually they could see on scans came back into the prefrontal cortex regions and neocortex. And so what I get a lot of individuals to do, if this is something they haven't had the opportunity to do much at all, is first understand that piece and then have the practice of when they're triggered, rather than going into the mind and the story or the past or the future, to get really present in their body and practice attuning to those sensations, describing their emotions, and that really reconnects them in those core moments. And then we go into afterwards, what is the core wound underneath that created that reactive response to begin with? And if we can recondition that. So for example, let's say somebody has this I'm abandoned core wound that causes all the panic in their body. Well, now they can somatically process it in those moments, and then when they feel more aligned and back to center, they can actually go into reprogramming this idea that they're always going to be abandoned, so that they don't always just have to deal with it somatically. They can do that in that reactive way, but also go underneath and do the reconditioning of those scary ideas as well.
Oh, oh, I love that. And yeah, those affect labeling fMRI studies are absolutely incredible. I love looking at those scans. It's interesting, right? Because we started talking about what a small percentage of our thoughts we actually have access to.
Yeah,
And it's really just such a potent reminder that while we might not have access to the majority of our thoughts, we can have so much influence on how we feel, how we process, how we move through life by simply sitting with it, by simply being with it. I was at a group coaching thing the other day with other coaches, and one of the coaches was talking about how she keeps getting so wildly dysregulated and she needs to, quote, work harder at regulation. And I just took a breath and I said, sweet pea, you don't need to like do more. You just get to be with yourself and be with your nervous system and just hold space for your nervous system. And I think that really is the shift, right? Is
it's
instead
a
of
really
just
great
doing,
point.
yeah, just being.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
funny, it reminds me of this great quote, an Eckhart Tolle quote, and he says, "The more identified we are with the mind, the more we suffer." And it's that ability to be in our body
Yeah.
really gives us space from that ongoing set of thoughts that are then causing the emotional reactions and causing the actions to take place. And by really just being, we kind of get out of that train that carries us away. And so a lot of that practice is so powerful in terms of regulating our nervous system and creating inner healing.
So beautiful. Such a powerful gift to not just give ourselves, but within the context of attachment styles and relating, what a gift to give our romantic partners, our parents, our friends, our kids, our cousins, or like everyone around us to just be a more present animal
Absolutely.
in the
Absolutely.
world.
I think it's hard for some people when they've never had this like knowledge or awareness before, because a lot of where people's attachment style comes from is that it wasn't safe to be.
Sure.
And so it's like that big piece where we can reintroduce that, to your point, in our adult lives of like maybe it wasn't safe to just be in being mode during childhood, but it doesn't mean that it still has to be that way as an adult. And
Right.
reintroducing that to ourselves can be this really sort of magical component of what's necessary to really heal.
Yeah. And that's where I bring sort of IFS based sort of internal family systems based sort of thinking. And I like to talk about how there probably was always a part that was just being. That part
Yeah,
just got really, really small and
absolutely.
stayed really quiet and maybe lived in the back of a cave somewhere, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And being
Yeah.
able to sort of integrate those pieces. It's so interesting. So I've done a little bit of the IFS work too. I feel like we have a lot
Yeah.
in
I
common.
know we're twinsing. I love it.
And what I found too that was so interesting doing a lot of core wound work is I found that it's very beneficial and effective when somebody was really stuck with like a protector part or things like that, to
Yeah.
also identify and reprogram the core wound that was causing that part to feel like it needed to go
Yeah.
into action. And there's this really interesting relationship between these core wounds and those different parts.
Yeah. Yeah. They really do inform each other, huh?
Yeah, yeah, it's really
Yeah.
cool.
I love that you're such a nerd, which is the biggest compliment available around
Thank you,
here.
I.
So you're welcome. And thank you, but also you're welcome.
And likewise, it's nice to be able to chat about these
But
things for
it's so
sure.
fun. It's so fun and so life changing,
Yeah,
right? It just makes
absolutely.
all this deep work really sucks. You know what I mean? Like it sucks. And then it doesn't. And all of life gets so much like I didn't realize how often I was on the struggle bus in all these majillions of little ways,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Based in all this core wounding and all these core stories and attachment style. And no one's on the other side of it, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
maybe the Dalai Lama would fight me on that if he was a fighting man. But to have done, the lion's share of this work, like in these really powerful ways in this last decade, it just feels so beautiful to move through life with so much more ease. I guess
Yes,
that's where I'm going, right? We
100%.
all get triggered. We all have struggles, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's wicked
And it's
nice.
it's always more work to not do the work. I know that it's like heavy
Right?
at first, but
Seriously.
it's always like way better to go that path. And it's funny because some people, when they're new to this work, I know that when they open up and they look, right, and we start introspecting, we start observing our patterns, we start feeling our feelings and noticing the
Uh-huh.
sensations. It can feel like a lot at first. And
Yeah,
some people will be like, yeah, it never really gets better. It really does get better.
it
Like
does.
I hear this all the time from people like, "Oh
Hmm.
yeah, no, it gets harder." No, it's a little difficult at first when we first look at things that we've never really looked at and we get in touch with
Right.
them, but it gets way easier. And so
Way
to anybody
easier.
listening who's
Yeah.
like, "I don't know," it really does get way easier. You'll never be perfect. There's never going to be this like, "Oh, I never get triggered again."
Or
Yeah.
you are perfect and you are
Ooh.
inherently perfect and it is human to get triggered and it is perfect to get triggered because
I
that is the
love that.
gift of your mind body telling you where to look.
I love that. I think
Yeah.
that's beautiful. I love that.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And thanks. Sorry to interrupt you, but
Oh,
I
no, it was
really,
perfect. I love that. It was
yeah,
beautiful.
we
Yeah.
are all so perfect. And this is just part of the human condition is like
Yeah.
having little areas of reactivity, you know?
And they
Yeah.
provide, like you said, it provides growth and feedback. Our emotions will literally give us feedback all the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's less about our neighbor who shouldn't be cutting their grass, and sometimes it's
Yeah.
more about
Rude. Yeah.
actually that's representing an unmet need that I have, or something deep within me, this core wound that's triggered,
Right.
that's coming up for me. And so they're always giving us perfect feedback, sometimes less about the external world than our internal world. But when we actually listen to what's there, it also provides us the opportunity to grow.
Yeah. Ah, this is so beautiful. I'm so loving your approach to this really powerful work, how nerdy it is and how loving and compassionate it is. Thais, I know you have a lot of really practical tips and tools that can really help folks. Would you be game to share a couple or one or two right now?
Absolutely.
Oh,
So
thank
I
you.
would I would love to share a core wound reprogramming tool. So it's such a big part of like these scary ideas we bring from our past in
Yeah.
childhood, right? So the I am abandoned core wound, or I'll be betrayed, or I'm not good
Oh,
enough, or I'll be
right.
trapped. So, when we look at these wounds, when we have this core wound, let's say, for example, just for simplicity's sake, it's I'm not good enough. You can think
Mm,
of a core wound as being like this belief that's like a tree trunk. And off of it come all these tree branches. If we think we're not good enough at our core, then we'll tell ourselves stories like, I'm not interesting enough, I'm not attractive enough, I'm not smart enough, whatever it is, fill
yeah.
in the blank enough. And how do we feel when we think those thoughts? Not very good, right? Sad, insecure, you name it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, neuroscience has proven every decision we make is based on our emotional state. So even people who think they're very logical and rational, they're just quick to rationalize through logic after they made their
Hmm.
decision. So what we want to be able to do is actually pluck those sort of weeds out at their root, like these old core wounds or ideas, so we don't have to constantly get triggered and then try to regulate the trigger and then, repeat the pattern. So there's a really simple tool. It's 3 steps. It's called belief reprogramming. It roots in cognitive behavioral therapy, but this tool I've created it overlaps the subconscious mind and hypnotherapy. It's almost like bringing CBT to the subconscious mind. So
Ooh.
so what we do is we first look and we realize, okay, what's this old core idea? So maybe it's I'm not good enough. Step one, what's its opposite? I am good enough. I'm unloved. I'm lovable. I'll be abandoned. I'll stay connected. Pick your belief. Step two is we don't just do an affirmation because our conscious mind speaks language, our subconscious speaks through emotion and imagery. If I say to
Mm,
you, whatever you do, do not think of the pink elephant. Your conscious mind hears do not, your subconscious
right.
probably flashed a pink elephant.
Right.
So we actually have to speak in emotion and imagery in order to recondition these subconscious ideas or old stories. Nobody's waking up every day being like, I'm going to tell myself consciously today that I'll be abandoned all day and see how I feel. So these are subconscious problems, not conscious problems.
Right.
So what we can do is we can go, okay, well, I need to speak to my subconscious mind. So emotion and imagery speak to the subconscious mind. What's the container of all emotions and images? Our memories.
Right.
So if you were to tell me your favorite childhood memory, you might be like, I was playing on the playground, and you would see the images of the slide, and you would probably smile as you're telling the story.
Right.
So what we do is we say, okay, step one, take the core wound and its opposite. I'm not good enough, I'm good enough. Step two, we come up with 10 pieces of memory of when we did feel good enough,
Ooh.
because then we get to speak, we use our conscious mind to speak to our subconscious mind through images and emotions.
Right.
And then step three, we record this and we listen back to it for 21 days. Because
Wow.
research shows it takes about 21 days for old neural pathways to atrophy and new ones to hardwire in. And if we
Right.
do that, especially in the morning or evening, like first thing when we wake up or
Right.
last thing before we go to bed, or in what we call a more suggestible state, our
Right.
brain is producing more alpha brain waves, which are actually the brain waves we need to be in a state of hypnosis. And so when we can leverage those 3 pieces, record in those old memories of when we did, for example, feel good enough, listen in the morning or evening, we can actually hardwire in these new ideas about ourselves and let go of those old things that have not been serving us and that we probably picked up somewhere, maybe in childhood, that we've been carrying for a very long time. We can leave the past back in the past where it belongs.
I love this. This leverages my favorite part of the brain, and I'd like to ask what yours is next, but the medial frontal cortex, which, as we talk about on the show, it holds the VHS tapes of our lives. right? Our prefrontal, our limbic system has the cassette tapes, the medial frontal has the VHS tapes. So that's video with audio combined. And it goes right in and re-records those tapes. And then we do memory reconsolidation, another thing we like to nerd about. We've been nerding about that in Anchor a lot lately. This is such a great, I love the way you break things down.
Thank you so
It's
much. Thank you.
fabulous.
I love this conversation. This has
It's so
been
much
so
fun.
fun to
It's so much fun. We should probably do it again. Yeah.
Absolutely,
Oh,
absolutely. Would
what a
love to do
delight.
that. And I'm so excited for you to join our podcast and do
I
an
know.
episode
I'm so
too.
excited. It's going to be fun. We're going to have so much nerdetry to dive so deep into. I know everyone listening wants to follow you, wants to learn more, wants to take your courses. Can you tell the good people where to find you, please?
Yes, absolutely. So I am on YouTube, Personal Development School dash Thais Gibson. It's THAIS. And then I also have courses online people can check out for how to become securely attached. We do like a 90-day kind of boot camp in there, and that's at personaldevelopmentschool.com. And so is an attachment style quiz. If anybody's like, what is my attachment style? It gives a big
Yes.
report with your core wounds and your needs and all these things to sort of be able to dig into.
That is so fun. And we'll link to everything in the show notes. So don't worry, if you didn't catch it the first time around, head over to victoriaalbina.com/podcast. You can find it there, get a lot more details. This was such a blast.
This was so fun. It was really nice
So
speaking with you, and thank
fun.
you so much for
Likewise.
having me.
Likewise, thanks for coming on, sharing your brilliance with the good people of feminist wellness.